This is the church that my parents attended when I was growing up. Members of my family have been baptized, married, and buried here. For our services, we drew on the rich tradition of Anglican hymns, following the biblical exhortation that we should lift up our hearts and sing. In the details of the story of Western church music are to be found insights into the human condition and into our relationship with God.
My school days were spent as a chorister here at St Paul's Cathedral, the beginning of a lifelong passion for choral singing. In this series, with Harry Christophers and his choir The 16, we'd like to take a journey through the last 150 years, looking at some of the great composers who shaped the world of sacred music. Over the next 4 episodes, I'll be travelling across Europe, from Germany and the music of Brahms and Bruckner to the intensely personal voices of Fauré and Poulenc in France. In Eastern Europe, I'll be looking at the music of Pärt and Gorecki and the role of sacred music as communism crumbled and the Iron Curtain was swept away. And in the 4th and final programme, I'll be searching out the links between music and spirituality in 21st century Britain.
But our story begins in 19th century Germany and Austria with the music of Brahms and Bruckner, 2 giant pillars of the great Germanic tradition and musical descendants of J.S. Bach. They were composers of great conviction, makers of music both sacred and secular, but 2 men who couldn't have been more different. Anton Bruckner, born in the secure heartland of a declining Austrian Empire, was a devout Catholic all his life, and his music is a confident affirmation of his faith. And Johannes Brahms, a North German Protestant. He confidently addressed questions of faith, death, and human existence, but ultimately found himself unable to believe in anything but his music.
By the end of his life, Johannes Brahms had secured his reputation as a great composer and a master of the symphony. But his early career was launched by his less well-known sacred choral music, work that is deeply personal, profoundly human, and distinctly German. So I've travelled to his hometown of Hamburg, the 2nd largest city in Germany.
In 1833, somewhere around here in Speckstrasse, then known as Specksgang or Bacon Alley, Johannes was born.
Johannes' parents were essentially a respectable working-class couple, but the area they lived in was desperately impoverished, frankly, a slum.
His father was charming and good-looking, and he worked as a bugler for the town militia and as a Bierfädler, a mildly contemptuous term for someone who plays music in the streets and in bars and cafes. Christiane, his mother, was 17 years older than her husband and had probably given up any hope of marriage. She was, however, a good cook and housekeeper and an excellent seamstress. Not particularly prepossessing to look at, she did have clear, sparkling blue eyes, a characteristic inherited by her son. By the time he was 13 years old, Johannes was already a pretty accomplished pianist. It seems that he was sent off to play in the Lokale, bars in the St. Pauli district around here, that also served as cafes, coffee houses, dance halls, and brothels. Later in life, he would describe his childhood as a curse, but he also said that he didn't regret it. Perhaps when he played the piano in the brothels, his fingers moving automatically, he was able to dream, compose, even read. He was a prodigious reader. In other words, the experience may have strengthened him. Here at St. Michael's Church in Hamburg, we can locate the roots of Brahms's spiritual life. He was born and brought up a Lutheran, of course, and he certainly took seriously Luther's insistence on the importance of a close personal study of the Bible. The Bible was a book that Brahms knew extremely well and used as a resource all his life. Brahms never made any clear statement about his beliefs, but seems to have been a true agnostic, doubting some of the fundamental doctrines of Christianity. Nothing, it was said, made him angrier than when it was assumed he was a conventional believer because of his religious compositions. For him, the Bible was a source of poetry, of morality, and perhaps a source of wisdom, but not necessarily the Word of God. For the music of Brahms, Harry and the choir have come to the church of St. Anne and St. Agnes in the city of London. It was built by Sir Christopher Wren after the Great Fire, virtually destroyed during the Blitz, and rebuilt in the 1960s for the Lutheran congregation of the city. It's an appropriate location to record some excerpts from the key work of Brahms's early career, the free-thinking and deeply humanistic German Requiem.
What's fantastic about the German Requiem is the whole story behind it, his whole personality behind it, the choice of texts, which for me is the most inspiring thing, that they are so personal to him and his beliefs.
Ladies and gents, can we have you, please?
Brahms, of course, sets his text in German, but because we've decided to perform some of the extracts in English translation, you might lose some of Brahms's perfect setting of the German syllables, but I do think you gain that immediacy of understanding.
As part of his research for this performance of the German Requiem, Harry has joined me in Hamburg for a visit to the Brahms Museum and to meet its director, Joachim Kossmann.
Hello, nice meeting you.
Hello, lovely to meet you. Hello.
Welcome to the Johannes Brahms Museum.
It's not just writing a requiem, it's taking the sections from the Bible, which he knew so well, and making something very personal, making his own statement. And that's what gives the piece its eternal musical life.
This is a very important document, because this is the handwriting of 8-year-old Brahms.
Beautiful.
Isn't it beautiful? It is a letter to his teacher saying, "I'm sorry, I haven't practiced enough last year, but I will practice more next year." Because the teacher, Otto Kossel, was always very critical about his compositions. He wanted him to practice piano. This teacher saw him becoming a piano virtuoso, but Brahms had other ideas.
The Requiem is a substantial work, over an hour long, normally performed with a huge orchestra and chorus. Harry has chosen to perform it in this much less well-known four-handed piano version.
This was Brahms's own arrangement at the request of his publisher. His publisher thought, in order to get the work better known, not only throughout Europe but also into England, let's make an arrangement for piano duet. We've actually got a Bösendorfer piano of the same period, so there's a particular quality to this Bösendorfer. It has a sort of thundering bass and a really eerie top register. Now, of course, you lose the colours of the orchestra, but what you do benefit from is that you get the vocal colours, which can get so lost in the big orchestral version.
The picture of Brahms that I grew up with is of an old man with a huge beard, huge white beard, stout, twinkly, but perhaps a little bit aggressive. This picture is very different. This is Brahms in his 30s, around about the time when he wrote the German Requiem. He's actually quite a slight young man, although his face is getting a little bit round. Very handsome, with those famous piercing blue eyes. But above all, this picture to me is a picture of determination and of confidence. Look at that tight-set mouth. I suspect that Brahms never doubted his own gifts. I think Brahms knew that he would make it, that he had something important to say.
In the spring of 1868, the young, unknown composer had a version of his Requiem ready for performance. And by his own admission feeling wretched with nerves, he made the journey to the cathedral city of Bremen, 100 kilometers west of Hamburg.
Brahms's worries weren't about technical matters like under rehearsal. No, I suspect his anxiety had deeper roots. The Requiem wasn't written on commission. It was something Brahms felt compelled to write, and it is patently a deeply felt statement of his faith, whatever that might be. It was also potentially controversial. A Requiem performed in a great cathedral on Good Friday, and absolutely no mention of Christ.
But 150 years after the event, it's not difficult to imagine why Brahms chose to unveil his masterpiece at the Easter concert in this beautiful and impressive cathedral.
The work is carefully titled Ein deutsches Requiem, a German Requiem. German in this case referring to the language sung rather than to the composer's fellow countrymen. Brahms said he almost called it a human requiem. As to Brahms's faith, well, around the time of the first performance of the Requiem, he wrote his conductor Rheintaler a letter. In it he said, I could dispense with passages like St. John chapter 3, verse 16. The passage he could dispense with goes like this. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Brahms couldn't have made himself clearer than that.
Brahms got away with it. His music was interspersed with pieces by other composers, Tartini, Bach, Schumann, and Rheintaler cleverly suggested that they should also perform Handel's great aria from the Messiah, I Know That My Redeemer Liveth. Brahms didn't object, and so Christ did get a mention after all.
Over 2,000 people came to listen, including friends and other influential musicians. Brahms, still in his 30s, had finally arrived. The original idea for the Requiem must have been closely bound up with the death of his mother. The first mention of the piece is in a letter written only a few months after she died, and so she must have been on his mind. And in the sublime fifth movement, which was held back from the performance here at Bremen, we find a promise of maternal comfort.
Now is your time of sorrow, but I will see you again.
The movement is a bit of a standalone movement. It's a totally different atmosphere from the other pieces. It's very comforting, I think that's the main word, reassuring. And I was told by a wonderful singing teacher, she says you have to imagine yourself as an angel, or possibly once you've had children, you imagine yourself as a mother. And that's certainly the way I think about it when I'm singing, this reassuring, comforting presence that's going to heal all the wounds and badness in people's struggle through life.
A Requiem Mass for the Dead, Missa pro Defunctis, is normally composed for performance at funerals or memorial services. The word Requiem comes from the first line of the standard Latin text, Requiem aeternam dona eis Domine, grant them eternal rest, O Lord. Brahms produced something different, a concert requiem, or with his piano version, even a domestic one.
Brahms was only 33, but death had already cast its shadow onto his soul. To uncover what I think is the earliest and deepest layer of inspiration for the German Requiem, we have to turn the clock back 15 years. While celebrating his 20th birthday hiking down the Rhine, Brahms passed through Dusseldorf, and there he had an encounter that would change his life.
Imagine the young Johannes, who was on holiday, deciding on the spur of the moment to come here to this house to call on one of his heroes, the composer Robert Schumann, and his wife Clara, formidable piano virtuoso. He'd never met them before, so he must have been extremely nervous. He knocked on the door, and they were both out. However, he came back the next day, tried again, and Robert Schumann answered the door. first floor of the house, so it could very well have been the place where the piano was and where music was played. So we can imagine Brahms coming here, his heart in his mouth, to meet the great composer and his formidable wife. So Brahms sat down and played one of his own piano pieces. At the end of the session, Robert Schumann turned around and said to the young man, he said, "You and I understand each other."
The Schumanns were German music's most celebrated couple. Always on the lookout for emerging talent, they now publicly proclaimed the unknown composer, scarcely out of his teens, as a genius. Brahms, Robert declared, was the chosen one, whilst Clara wrote that he had come as if sent directly from God. This all must have had a huge impact on Brahms' self-confidence, but their friendship was to be cruelly cut short after only a year, when Robert Schumann was afflicted with mental illness. It was a descent into hell. He was seized by violent attacks of hallucinations, and with tragic irony, he was tortured by strange, unearthly music and nightmarish, mocking voices.
Finally, he could stand it no longer. One night, he ran from his house in his dressing gown, came to a bridge, and threw himself into the Rhine. He didn't succeed in killing himself, was dragged from the river by some fishermen, and asked to be taken to an asylum.
2.5 years later, the great romantic composer Robert Schumann was dead. His wife Clara and his young protégé Brahms were stricken with grief. A decade on, Brahms still felt it as an enduring and agonizing loss.
In the sixth movement of the German Requiem, there's an anger that was boiling up in him. Brahms really was, crying out to God, why have you taken, Schumann away from us, away from me and the musical world? Brahms just erupts. It's really incredibly exciting music.
Harry, there's so many interior contemplative moments in the Requiem. This is not one of them, is it? This is hugely, obviously dramatic.
Dramatic, almost angry at times.
Yes.
I mean, I feel he suddenly gets the choir to sing this amazing legato, rich harmonies going around.
It's almost like the opera he didn't write, it seems to me. I mean, the choir are now singing at absolute full pelt, aren't they?
Yes.
fabulous, absolutely fabulous.
It's a marvellous bit to sing, isn't it? I mean, suddenly this, release and you can be expansive and...
It's hope, isn't it? I mean, it's a positive defiance, isn't it? That lovely.
I think the whole thing about this requiem is it is a requiem of hope.
Out of his personal experiences and emotions, his very human anger and grief, Brahms had produced a masterpiece. Beautiful choral music with sincere sentiments that resonated with audiences and performers, no matter what their faith or religious beliefs. After playing through the four-handed piano arrangement, Clara Schumann wrote to the composer, "This is a truly tremendous work of art, and it moves the entire being like nothing else before it." Within 5 years, the work had been sung across Germany and had had performances in Vienna, Paris, and London.
Brahms' Requiem is one of the most challenging pieces to sing. I think you need immense stamina to get through it, not just vocally, but actually emotionally. The singers have to find the depth within themselves and the strength to cover all the places Brahms wanted to take you. When you have a whole performance of it in one go, I think the audience is very often shocked to feel the immensity of emotion.
It's a remarkable achievement. The Requiem made Brahms's name and reputation, and though still a young man, he now settled into his role as a major composer. He moved to Vienna, the European capital of music, and while there he created some of the 19th century's greatest and most deeply felt symphonic music. And it was the symphony that drew our second composer, Anton Bruckner, to Vienna as well. Despite some similarities, these were two men from very different spiritual backgrounds. In contrast to Brahms's upbringing within the Protestant tradition, Anton Bruckner was a devout Roman Catholic. In order to explore some of his magnificent sacred music, Harry Christophers and his Choir of the 16 have chosen to visit Dowie Abbey, a monastery in Berkshire. Here, the Abbey Church possesses both the appropriate devotional atmosphere and a generous acoustic that allows Bruckner's unique voice to be heard. This is Anton Bruckner, photographed shortly before his death in 1896, when, after a lifetime of obscurity and failure, he had finally been recognized as one of the great composers of his age. During his years of struggle, it was the church and the composition of church music that he turned to time and time again for consolation. The first of 11 children, Anton was born in Ansfelden, a village hidden away in a forgotten part of Upper Austria. The community was conservative, even reactionary, untroubled by any new ideas being hatched in the big world outside. For a child born here, expectations cannot have been very great. Like so many Austrians of the time, the Bruckners were pious people. The most important legacy of Anton's upbringing was his unshakable faith. Even when in later life he may have had doubts about his music, he never lost trust in his God and the Roman Catholic Church. Anton's father died when he was only 12 years old. On the very same day, his mother brought him here, to the great monastery of St. Florian, and begged the prior to take him on as a chorister. This was an act not so much of callousness as of rigorous good sense. Despite his age, Anton was a little too old. The prior agreed to take him on. His mother was not to know that she'd introduced her son to the place that was to be for the rest of his life, his spiritual home. In this beautiful and ancient establishment of work and prayer, Bruckner was protected from the outside world, first as a boy chorister, then in his 20s as the church organist. He felt he had a calling to serve God as a musician and as a composer of sacred music. Well, there it is, the organ that Bruckner played while he was at the monastery. It's rather impressive. Klaus, thank you very much for that. So, you were playing Bruckner's organ.
Yes, this is the organ which inspired Bruckner very much for his work,
Yes.
his composing. It's not the original console, you can see, it's a modern piece installed in 1951.
So, but the rest of the organ, the pipes, would have been
Yes.
what he knew.
Yes, that's right. The case is original with more than 7,300 pipes.
It's a big, big organ. And his duties would be to play at every service.
I think he played a lot of services.
He used to, we know, improvise.
Improvising was the specialty of Anton Bruckner. We know that he did compose few pieces for the organ because he was a big improviser and a very good improviser.
In this self-contained world, the music making that accompanied every ritual and service was traditional and conservative. For the budding composer Bruckner, this was a technical education in Catholic church music at its most refined, pure and profound.
We know he loved the music of Palestrina and indeed other Renaissance composers, looked at the way that that music was built and built on it, enlarging into a whole succession of masses, which tend to get just bigger and bigger.
Hello.
Nice to meet you.
It's a pleasure.
Ah, this is absolutely beautiful. Friedrich, you're one of the librarians in this extraordinarily beautiful library. I put these gloves on, didn't I?
Yes.
This book is...
This is a copy of the Missa Solemnis, composed by Anton Bruckner here in the monastery.
My reading of German is non-existent, so that says...
Missa Solemnis in B zur hochfeierlichen Infoliierung des hochwürdigsten Herrn Prälaten Friedrich I. The provost was elected in 1854, and for the feast, Anton Bruckner composed this Missa Solemnis.
So this was printed in...
It is handwritten by himself, by Anton Bruckner.
So this is by Bruckner?
Yeah.
Wow. Now can I open it further? See what his script is like. Oh, wow. Oh, the labour of love of all this. It is fantastically neat, isn't it?
Yeah.
This almost obsessive neatness gave me an insight into the dogged dedication that Bruckner brought to his calling as a composer in the service of God. He'd only just turned 30, and the writing of this solemn mass proved to be a turning point in his development. It was the last composition he dared to commit to paper for 5 years. Perhaps realizing that he still had much to learn and that he needed to grow as a musician, he decided to move on. When he was offered the post of organist here at Linz Cathedral, he was told he looked a little shabby and might have to tidy himself up a bit, although his playing was magnificent and, of course, he was offered the job. Bruckner hesitated. He managed to persuade the monastery to keep his old job open for 2 years, and only when he had that reassurance would he take up his new post. Now that he was a fully fledged professional musician, the hard work could begin. Over the next 5 years, instead of composing, he decided to take lessons, a correspondence course with a Viennese teacher, Simon Sector, in harmony and counterpoint. In fact, he worked so hard that his teacher was impelled to write him a letter which said, "I do implore you to take care of yourself and allow yourself sufficient relaxation." If anything, Bruckner's love for the church was becoming even more intense. This motet, written for the dedication of a chapel in Linz, seems to translate this love directly into music. Locus iste ad Deo factus est, inestimabile sacramentum irreprehensibilis est. This dwelling is God's handiwork, a mystery beyond price that cannot be spoken against.
His Catholicism is something that speaks through maybe in the simplicity of what he does, but also in the waves of sound and emotion. Even something as simple as, say, Locus iste starts so quietly, so gently, but it goes to this massive sound in the middle. It really feels like opening a door into his religious landscape.
After 10 years in Linz, Bruckner, aged 42, suffered a severe nervous breakdown and was sent to a sanatorium. He described it as a condition of utter degradation and loneliness, and it drove him to the edge of suicide. Although he recovered this time, it left a legacy of anxiety and fear, and he decided that he had to leave Linz. For the rest of his long life, he earned his living as a teacher of music while struggling to build his reputation as a symphonic composer in the capital of the Austrian Empire, Vienna. The apartment that was Bruckner's home for nigh on 2 decades is now a suite in the Hotel de France. By the 1870s, both Brahms and Bruckner had made their homes here in the Austrian capital. Brahms, now a musical celebrity thanks to the German Requiem, was in his mid-30s. Bruckner, around 10 years older, was still working in semi-obscurity.
So I'll be sleeping tonight in Anton Bruckner's room. It feels slightly odd when we've lost so much of the physical world that these two composers knew to be here, somewhere quite so intimate. I don't expect to see any ghosts, but I do expect a good night's sleep.
For both composers, Vienna was the ultimate test.
It could lay claim to being the European capital of music, indeed of the arts, and any German-speaking composer must have dreamt of making it here. Brahms rented 2 rooms here in Karlsgasse. A friend described them as the sort of place suitable for a student, a minor civil servant, or a salesman starting out in trade. They were, frankly, shabby, and in Viennese eyes at least, not remotely appropriate for a great artist. But then that was typical of the man. He was a bundle of contradictions, mean-spirited yet tender, progressive, reactionary. He once boasted that he could find any passage in his Bible instantly, even in the dark.
Like Bruckner, he was still writing sacred music.
Above all, he was drawn to the bleak agony and the harsh questions of the Book of Job. Wherefore is light given to him that is in misery, and life unto the bitter in soul, which long for death, but it cometh not? Why is light given to a man whose way is hid, and whom God hath hedged in?
If a German requiem had promised comfort to the living in the presence of death, then this motet, with its cry of despair and subsequent sense of stoic resignation, offers another individual response to the deaths that had clouded Brahms's life. It was inevitable that Brahms and Bruckner would meet, but surprisingly, it was in neither the concert hall nor the church.
Our two composers had a taste for cold draft Pilsner, and the best beer in Vienna could be found at an eating house called Zum Roten Igel, the Red Hedgehog. The place rang with the sounds of fierce arguments between various cliques, proselytizing for their chosen musical champions. Accounts of the two masters meeting bristle with discomfort and suppressed aggression. Brahms privately thought Bruckner a deluded fool ruined by priests. His music was a swindle. Bruckner, meanwhile, dismissed Brahms as a craftsman, not a composer. Thank you, sir. In the best description we have of one of their encounters, Brahms is cold and dismissive, whilst Bruckner, always polite, sometimes even obsequious, scuttles off to get his great rival a beer. Nice and cold.
This is Bruckner's rather bird-like face with, in this case, quite a beady stare. He never sported a beard, unlike more fashionable men of his time, and he was mocked by the sophisticated Viennese for his odd behaviour. And is there an indication here, too, in his expression of the insecurities he often felt about the wider world beyond the safety of the church?
Bruckner's writing is so of him and his beliefs. We see that same fervour and personality and love of his church coming through. This sheer power, emotion is so profound. He's put so much of his own personality into the music.
It's loud, isn't it?
It is very loud.
It's
But it's the
very loud.
impact, it's the
Fantastic.
cumulative impact. Fantastic.
Can you tell me how Bruckner achieves his effects in this?
In this particular piece, he uses a sort of refrain, really, uses it 3 times in all, and he builds it up from a succession of root position chords.
Which are the simplest chords you
Absolutely,
can get.
yeah. He starts from E major, then goes to A minor, right through G major, E flat, ending up in C major. So it goes right through the progression. I mean, we're just going to sing that progression of chords.
That's fantastic. And they don't quite go where you expect them to go. Not
No,
quite. There are a
it
couple of
certainly
surprises
doesn't.
in there.
And at the beginning, he just has the sopranos and altos with the organ, and the men are with the trombones until we get to this fantastic F major, C major finish, and everything comes together. It's quite brilliant. Let's hear it.
The power and originality of Bruckner's sacred music proved to be no barrier to its ready acceptance as music for worship in the Catholic Church. But for his secular orchestral music, it was a different story. The musical establishment's response to his earliest symphonies was criticism and indifference. Then, after 20 years of misunderstanding, his 7th symphony, as vast and ambitious as a cathedral, found an audience. But the recognition Anton Bruckner craved had come almost too late.
As he grew older, he was unable to hide his increasingly obsessive behaviour. What started out simply as counting bars in music erupted into numeromania. He would count everything: grains of sand, stars in the sky, leaves on a tree, even the pearls sewn onto ladies' dresses, rigorously returning to his starting point when he lost his tally. And his prayers, always strictly observed, became ever more feverish.
For Bruckner, every experience was intense and absolute, and every act of composition was an act of prayer. In the Roman Catholic faith, the Virgin Mary is a bringer of comfort, and in his profound devotion to her, Bruckner set the text Ave Maria 3 times.
In his final year, Bruckner, now frail and with a mind wandering alarmingly, was offered a place to live by the Emperor himself here at the Belvedere Palace. He must have felt extremely proud that a man from a small village in Upper Austria had been deemed worthy of such an honor. His last day started unexceptionally. He worked in the morning on the finale of his Ninth Symphony, and then in the early afternoon he went for a stroll in the public gardens. He then returned to his small apartment, where he died.
The funeral of Anton Bruckner took place on the 4th of October 1896 in Vienna's most beautiful church, the Karlskirche.
The church was packed. When Brahms came to pay his respects, an attendant assured him that yes, they could probably squeeze him in. But he hesitated and then turned to leave. He was heard to mutter, "Never mind, soon my coffin." Bruckner's body was brought home to the monastery of St. Florian and laid to rest directly underneath the great organ on which he had learned to play and to compose. Once, when he was asked what he might say to his God if required to give an account of his life here on earth, Bruckner allegedly replied, "I will present to him the score of some of my work, and he will judge me mercifully."
Johannes Brahms was only 63 when Bruckner died, but his life too was nearly over.
If Bruckner was assured of the immortality of his soul, then Brahms was assured of this, that his immortality lay in his work. He composed less and less during those final years, and inevitably, friends that he'd cared for and members of his family died. He must have been hit terribly hard in 1896 when he heard of the death of Clara Schumann.
She had been his greatest friend ever since that first meeting in Dusseldorf 40 years earlier. Now, the last link with Brahms' inspiration and hero, Robert Schumann, was gone.
His last composition was this set of organ preludes based on chorales that he must have heard in church as a child. They were found at his apartment after his death, and perhaps he would never have published them himself.
Simple and sweetly melancholic, they seem to look back to the happier days of Brahms's youth.
It's kind of difficult to work out exactly what he was hoping to achieve with these chorale preludes, but I think that it was just a sort of homage to Robert Schumann and to Clara. And it's the sort of thing that people do in later life, which is to sort of go back to something that they feel has been left undone, and that may well have been it.
It took a long time for Brahms to admit that he was ill with cancer. But inevitably, the time came when he had to take to his bed. And finally, on the 3rd of April, 1897, Johannes Brahms died. This is where Brahms was finally laid to rest, in what he himself had called a sacred place, next to his friend Johann Strauss and near Schubert and Beethoven, a great composer amongst his peers. For Brahms, life was a struggle, something to be endured. His music doesn't seem to have been written in praise of God, nor does he really address him directly. The nearest he comes to that is to ask the question, why? And even then, he seems uncertain as to whether God is actually listening. His music provides us, his fellow human beings, with comfort, glimpses of a transient beauty, and perhaps the promise after death of a long sought for and well-deserved rest. In the next episode of Sacred Music, my journey takes me to Paris to discover the exquisitely French church music of Gabriel Fauré and Francis Poulenc.
And Sacred Music continues next Friday here on BBC4 at the same time with the music of Fauré and Poulenc. Next tonight, we're heading to the races with Storyville in Barbados.